TWO FACE ANNIHILATIon. Audio excerpt read by the author. The destiny of the world is determined less by battles that are lost and won than by the stories it loves and believes in. Harold Goddard. I looked in your head and saw annihilation. Scarlet Witch, Avengers Age of Ultron. Chapter 1. Nowhere. Collecting facts is important, knowledge is important, but if you don't have an imagination to use the knowledge, civilization is nowhere. Ray Bradbury. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Special Agent Graham Coder steps off the plane under cold, brooding skies at the obscure Appleton International Airport. It's a chilly Monday morning, 19 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 7 degrees Celsius, with a slight but steady 6-mile-per-hour breeze sailing in from the north. Behind the federal agent is a blonde woman from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, Agent Tammy Lee. A slight man with a brown mustache, Detective Dave Baumhover from the Frederick Police Station in Weld County, Colorado, completes the small investigative outfit. The trio make their way through the modern, if modest, honeycomb of Appleton Airport, collect their belongings, and march outside to a designated vehicle. Standing by their vehicle, the three are grateful, perhaps, that, unlike in Denver, it's snowy, but not snowing in Wisconsin. Although there's a cold bite in the air, it's not quite as sharp as in Colorado. The engine burns. The white crystal headlights fire on. The team heads due south of the airport, about 60 miles through snow-blanketed, rural, gently rolling countryside towards the small town of Warpen. Grey clouds hold flakes, like a storm holding its cards, anticipating its next play. During the almost hour-long drive parallel to the hanging scrotum that is Lake Michigan, there's a sense of nowhereness about this part of America. The nowhereness isn't accidental. The nearest large centers are Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Chicago, and Detroit, respectively 4 hours drive due west, 2 and 3 hours south, and 7 hours by car in an easterly direction into Michigan. Appleton Airport is roughly equidistant to Warpen as it is to Manitowoc. Just as Greeley is synonymous with the prosecution, or lack of the Chris Watts case, the modest city of Manitowoc is associated with the infamous Stephen Avery trial. Over the past decade, the city's justice system has repeatedly been undermined, embarrassed, or come under fire thanks to the popular flush and push of Making a Murderer documentaries. It's widely thought that Avery's prosecution for the murder of Teresa Halbach has been excessive. Here, now, in the middle of winter in 2019, the opposite is true of Chris Watts. Many believe Watts has been let off the hook by prosecutors by not having the family annihilator stand trial to answer for his crimes. Do the investigators discuss a game plan during the drive? Do those not driving study notes or highlight areas they intend to focus on? Do they have a script for how to initiate the interview and plans to record it? Have the two agents who managed to get Watts to confess briefed the detective on how to work the prisoner? At 7:45 sharp, the trio turn up at the gates of Dodge Correctional Institution, a male-only maximum security correctional facility housing 1,765 inmates. This is bright and early for a weekday visit. Typically, Dodge only allows visits to inmates in the general population after 1500 hours on weekdays and only twice a week at that. Visits are generally restricted to no more than 2 hours on weekdays, stretched out to no more than 3 on weekends. But the investigative team are anything but typical, and neither is the man they are hoping to interview at length. He has no idea they're coming, but that's all part of the plan. That was TWO FACE Annihilation, Book 7 in the 9-part series on Chris Watts. Annihilation was published on April the 8th, 2019. It was comparatively short compared to the preceding 2 narratives at only 184 pages. The book was quite easy to write because it dealt with the relatively brief discovery released in, I think it was early March. That was the CBI report. It was basically 31 pages that didn't verbatim transcribe the interview, but certainly provided some detail about the interrogation. What made Annihilation easier to write was the fact that the volume of new evidence was fairly concise, and there was only one interview conducted sort of in one day, and so it was sort of a very clear project to break down and to figure out. There was quite a lot of hype and controversy and confusion and agitation around the second confession. During the second confession, Watts made quite a few surprising admissions. He admitted having sex with Shanann. He admitted that she'd slept with him, as in the bed. He said that she hadn't washed her face and so on. But I think the most sort of controversial and shocking was when he reluctantly described the murders of his children. According to him, he spoke about Bella's last words. He even sort of role-played in a way how Bella spoke to him, just saying, Daddy, Mommy smells, and saying that, are you going to do to me what you just did to Cece, and that sort of thing. I'm not sure how long I went along with what Watts was saying when I first heard it, but I certainly didn't come out of it believing his scenario. I didn't believe the scenario about him having sex with Shanann, and I didn't believe the scenario of murdering the children at the well site. But there were many people who did. There were many credible commentators, including on YouTube, that basically have taken Watts' version as gospel and simply taken that to be the official version. I found that surprising. I found that disappointing. I also find the media narrative to be, in a way, if you say that the Watts case is the reason for the murders was cowardice. The reason for the murder was the failure to confront his wife, the failure to acknowledge the affair, the failure to be honest. I think we also have a mirror in that in the coverage of the case. I think we have the same cowardice from the media to properly deal with what actually happened, to properly interrogate the people involved and the evidence. I think we have the same cowardice from the prosecutors. I think we don't have a accurate and true version from them about what they even think happened. I think they are happy to allow the narrative to fizzle and to sort of be shut down. And when there was concern about information, the reaction from the district attorney was to say, well, the case is closed. We are not investigating this case any further. And this was in contrast. This was a contradiction to what he'd said at the sentencing hearing, when he said we'll never know why. And even if we ask him, we'll probably never know why. And even though that's true, it was suggesting that he wanted to know why, and that he was interested in knowing why, and that all these resources were employed to know why. And that is why it's so frustrating for someone like me, who's a true crime author, where we can know why, we do know why, we can find out why, and yet we're not going to address it. We're going to simply take his dubious version of events, which in both cases, in terms of both sets of murders, they don't really make sense. They don't really stand up to scrutiny. And you've got to make a choice on a certain set of circumstances. You've got to say, was it a premeditated murder or not? If it was premeditated, you're not going to have emotional aspects to the execution of the crime. You're not going to have leaving the crime to the last moment and I'm not sure what I was doing or I wasn't thinking. All of it is pre-planned. And when you look at the fabric of the well site, when you look at the aerial photos, you get a sense of how the crime is hidden in plain sight. I mean, there's not a better metaphor for the vanishing of these poor people, these poor little children, and Shanann, and the fetus. There's no better symbol of this turning them invisible than when you look at the tapestry of the well site from the drone, from high up. And I think many people assume that the sheet would be very visible, and I kind of imagined in my mind the sheet sort of being partially buried in dirt, and sort of the ears of the sheet sort of flapping around. And it really was hard to believe that Watts had simply left the sheet out in the open. And but even so, and so that conveyed the impression that the sheet was sort of just lying there, but it wasn't very visible. The sheet, when you look at the aerial photos, no one could see the sheet from the sort of parking pad where they were parked. So it wasn't sort of visible in plain sight. If someone was arriving at the well site, especially just an oil worker. You had to elevate yourself, and even if you looked from the drone, the sheet is this tiny little fragment that is easy just to not even see. And there are three items in that aerial shot that even though they are in plain sight, they remain almost invisible. And these are the bed sheet, the two garbage bags, and then also the sort of cleared away piece of earth. Even though all three of these were in plain sight, it's still difficult to actually see them. And that is an excellent metaphor for this case, is that a heck of a lot was hidden in plain sight, in terms of what's his work day, in terms of putting the kids to bed, in inverted commas, in terms of Shanann arriving home and then, according to Watts, going to sleep, having sex with him as per the usual nuptials of a couple that are together, and then he murders her as an afterthought, and she doesn't struggle, and she's facing him, and there's no struggle for survival, there's no fighting back, there's no words, there's no look in her eyes, it's all just mute. And none of that is believable. And so that was really the challenge to some extent with this particular narrative. Now, I think if I had come to the Watts case late, if I'd not written the 6 books preceding, and I'd come to this particular book just with the CBI report, I think the narrative would have been very different. I think it would have been basically just criticizing his version of events, but not really being able to, take away what he's saying, but not necessarily being able to put something in his place. And that is, I think, the value of the first narratives is, you're presented with a unknown scenario. You don't have the evidence. You don't have the information. You've got a little bit of insight into the psychology of this guy. You get the sense that he doesn't wear the pants and that his wife wears the pants, and he's socially awkward, but he's kind of a numbers guy as well. And then you've got the facts of the case. You've got the facts that he gets up in the morning and that he then drives to the well site, and that it's all hidden within in a schema that seems to sort of play out normally. But even that isn't completely normal. It's not completely normal that Watts would sort of go to the well site as per normal. So it's all hidden within plain sight, and there's no better metaphor for that besides the actual fabric of the well site than Watts's phone. Having that secret calculator app on the phone, everything is there, but you can't see it. Again, it's hidden in plain sight. And this is why I think of Watts as a silver fox, as very sly. People call him a narcissist and a sociopath. That's not, you can call him those names, but that's not going to acknowledge that he had a scheme when he committed these crimes. There was a possibility of him getting away with it if his social game had been better, and if he'd made a few adjustments. If he'd taken Shanann's phone with him. And who knows why he didn't. Maybe he was going to pretend that she was still alive by, putting up Facebook posts and maybe answering messages. And, that is something that Patrick Frazee is accused of doing in terms of the disappearance of his wife. And, one could argue that just that aspect of muddying the time of death and murking the place of death shifts the pendulum significantly into the defense case. And had Watts been able to do that, had he been able to just send one message, at some point implying that Shanann was either alive or that she was going somewhere, who knows how the outcome could have been different. The fact is he didn't, but in terms of the disposal, that was done in a way that was actually quite impressive, and ultimately difficult to discover and difficult to do sort of an audit in terms of the autopsy. I'm not going to deal in detail with the contents of the CBI report, but there was certainly very interesting new information regarding Watts's relationship with Nicole Kessinger, also Watts's relationship with Shanann, and the situation with things like the finances. They were provided in more detail. In addition to this, there was the sort of addressing of, let's call it almost the mythology surrounding this case. So, for example, Watts said that the whole Trent Bolt thing was not true. And also Amanda McMahon, he said that his affair with Kessinger was the first. I've thought about that quite a lot, and I think I've got a feeling those characters aren't innocent players in this little circus. It's almost as if both of those characters came into the narrative to distract from Kessinger, to make people sort of more focused on, was he gay, was he bisexual, who's Trent Bolt, who is this other woman. And so while they were engaging with the media, Kessinger wasn't, and so distracted from the idea that from the whole Anadarko thing. Instead of the media and the public, who would naturally have turned their gaze towards Anadarko, their gaze instead was turning towards this strange homosexual character, and this also strange other lady who was claiming that she had sort of violent sex with him. So that's another very intriguing aspect, and it was one of the first that the investigators tested Watson, and he said that that wasn't the case. It was also interesting how Watts had sort of extended clemency to himself by, in a way, saying that it didn't matter what anyone thought of him. What mattered now was that God forgave him, and that now that was seemingly his focus, is that he'd become a Christian, and that seems to be quite a strong aspect now, and seems to be why and how this other book has come about, is that Watt started engaging with a Christian woman on Christian subjects, and that then got hijacked into some other kind of narrative. I'm not going to go into that further, but the psychology is also quite interesting, is that at the time when we see Watts in the first interrogation, he is somewhat self-deprecating, where Coda tells him, "You're a good man." He interrupts him and says, "I'm not a good man." He says to his father, "I'm never going to see the light of day," and all that kind of thing. And there is a kind of sort of a sober remorse when at that stage, when he's caught and it's sort of over. And yet, just a few months later, he's in another jail, and he seems happy. He's talking about how good the food is, and he's talking with the police almost as if they're on the same level. And that is one of the aspects that's really crazy about this case, is that Watts can talk as though he's divorced from his own situation, that he doesn't seem to appreciate the gravity of his own situation. He seems to be pretending that things are better than they are. He seems to be unable to get out of that pretense. And so that was an aspect that certainly made this this aspect a little bit challenging, and that is when Coda and Lee and Baumhover were talking to Watts, and he said things that were dubious and unlikely. How did they then respond? And there is a little bit of them pushing him one way or another. There are aspects where Coda flatters Watts, as he did in the first confession, where he tells him how much they like him, I guess, and how much they find him an interesting person in terms of their work. But they also then push him to talk about his children, which he doesn't want to do, and they say, well, you're welcome to not talk about certain things, but they then do push him into that sort of narrative. And there are aspects that I think were done well, but for example, where Coda sort of prods Watts to say, was CC first, and it's the same sort of thing that happened during the first confession, where they were leading Watts, like when they said, did Shanann have something to do with this? Are you covering for Shanann? There's some of that same leading, and with the result that you end up with another confession that's not reliable, and that's not adequate, and the ordinary members of the public are sort of just taking the low-hanging fruit, that they're not listening to how circumspect the investigators are, and they're not critically thinking about just how unlikely this version is, that you would have your children basically sitting on their mother's dead body. And these are children who are easily agitated, who will scream when they're anxious, and who will cry when they're not happy. And in the last days of their lives, the children were screaming for their mother. And in fact, Watts even said, he didn't want to FaceTime with his children because they would, if their mother was somewhere else, I'm talking about when Shanann was away, then they would scream for her, kind of thing. So they seemed like quite anxious children, and that they could be easily upset and difficult to soothe. Um, and so I think that that aspect just isn't acknowledged in terms of the CBI report and Watts' version there. Another aspect that's not really addressed is Watts conveys the whole thing as he just snapped. He didn't know what he was doing. He was out of his mind. Everything was in a rage. And you take that and you say, okay, but then when you've now got two sets of discovery, and when you overlay them with what Watts was saying, and you can look at how he behaved after the disposal of the bodies. He laughs with his colleagues. He sends very matter-of-fact text all the time, and it's very business-like. He's getting things done. He calls his realtor. He calls the school, and it's all very meticulous, and it's all very well thought out. And even when he appears in front of the police, he seems, although he starts swaying later on, but initially he seems like he's in control. He's within himself. And so what he's saying in the interview, and the way that the evidence in terms of the cell phone evidence and so on, it shows a different face to Chris Watts. And so that was also quite validating, is that this, the title I came up with right in the beginning of Two-Face has been borne out through the entire series, and it was even something that, when the books came out, I didn't know what Codad said in his private interrogations with Watts. So at the time the books came out, when Codad already had those conversations, nobody knew about them. And so it was quite also gratifying to see that he even said to Watts in a very kind of convincing moment, he said to Watts during an interrogation, there are two Chris's. There's this one and that one, and that is literally the title of this series. And so, and I think that speaks very well of this entire case in terms of Chris Watts, but also Shanann in a sense. A lot of people look at Shanann as sort of angelic and innocent and perfect and everything, but there is also another side to Shanann. Shanann could get really angry. She could be controlling. There's the OCD aspect, and we're not looking at any of these people to judge them. We're saying this is simply how people are and how these people were, and it's part of how we acknowledge how we are. We can also be two-faced, including on social media, and the way that law enforcement have treated this is also in a two-faced way, and how the media have treated this, where you give credence to certain aspects of the narrative but not to others, is also two-faced. So I think when we acknowledge that then we're getting to grips with this particular narrative. So yeah, I'm very happy with Two Face Annihilation. It was a easier book to write, and it was a shorter book, and it was certainly there were certainly a lot of sparks flying at the time. When Watts made apparently these revelations, Dr. Full came in on it, and the Rusek lawyers repeated it, and so on. And again, I think that was what also made Annihilation a strong narrative. Is it was important to counter the weak analysis of what was happening on television, and by these lawyers who simply parroted what Watts was saying. They simply said what he said, they repeated. And if there were aspects they didn't agree with, they didn't really provide an alternative. They simply said that wasn't likely, or that was horrible. And so to date, the only narrative that has really presented a compelling alternative, a compelling, plausible possibility for what really happened, isn't Chris Watts, isn't the media, isn't television or talk shows, isn't any other book that exists on the subject, and isn't even in the Discovery. The Discovery doesn't say where the crime really happened. It simply provides the sort of hamster wheel of information as it came out. It doesn't actually provide the point of view of the authorities, other than where Baumhover speaks about the arrest affidavit. There's some inklings in there that the crime appeared premeditated, and then we see the same thing in the brief appearance in court of the district attorney, where he also said it was a cold, callous, calculated crime, and it wasn't a crime of passion, and that he didn't just snap. And of course this is what he said in the second confession. And we haven't really heard the district attorney come back to that and say, well, you know, it is premeditated, whatever the case may be. So Two Face Annihilation is available on Kindle. It's the second book in the series that's released after the Discovery. It's really the first book that's released after all the Discovery. So I think one of the reasons why it's one of the really best books in the series. Book 6, while it was published on March 3rd, it doesn't really deal with the second confession. And so Annihilation is really the first book that does deal with everything. And that's why I think it is so highly rated. Yeah, so it's available on Kindle with a lot of links to the audio and links to the Discovery and links to some of the images and screen grabs I put on Crime Rocket. If you've been enjoying these podcasts, please, so what do you want to call them, audio excerpts, please subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and be sure to visit crimerocket.com, where we're leaving a lot of analysis. There's also crimerocket2.com, which is kind of an overflow site, and where some additional cases are being slowly assembled, including the Patrick Frazee case and others. Also be sure to have a look at the coverage on the Amanda Knox case, which has really taken the baton from Malcolm Gladwell. He's written a book about the Amanda Knox case, and there's a chapter in the book about Amanda Knox, which is further illustrates this whole idea where the media collaborates and contaminates in a narrative that doesn't make any sense, and the media admits that it doesn't make any sense, but then the explanation doesn't make any sense either. And so what you've had in the Watts case, we now also have in the Amanda Knox case, and you'll see it's really interesting how I really respect Gladwell. I think he's an intelligent guy, but his application to true crime is less stellar. It's less impressive. I think people who, no matter what your thoughts about the Amanda Knox case, if you're interested in the Chris Watts case, you might want to have a look at how there are certain intertextualities in terms of the media coverage, and in terms of the journalists, and in terms of just the way that some suspects are treated, and how the narrative kind of goes off on its own yellow brick road, which isn't really reality anymore. And once again, this is why we need true crime rocket science. We need an authentic narrative to counter the bogus narratives that are out there. Thank you for listening.